Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Cerquera, and I'm an English major, and I worked on this project with the help of my advisor, Professor Karobkin. And it's titled Reading as Translation, How Different Readers Interpret the Writing of Sandra Cisneros. And it's a literary analysis of two texts by Cisneros, focusing on how the experiences, language background, and knowledge of the readers influence the way that they interpret her texts. So just to provide some background on who Sandra Cisneros is and what she writes about, she's one of the most prominent Mexican-American writers. She was born in Chicago and now lives in San Antonio, and is often referred to Texas as the borderlands between Mexico and the United States. She was the first Chicana author to receive a contract with a major American publishing house, and she is frequently taught in American high schools and universities. She often talks about and writes about Chicana characters who live on the border between Mexico and the United States, feel cross between these cultures, and characters who speak a hybrid language of English mixed with Spanish. As a Chicana writer, Cisneros has said that she sees herself as a translator. In an interview, she once said, "I take my responsibility seriously of being a woman who lives on the border of cultures, a translator for a time when all of these communities are shifting and colliding in history. Chicanos have that unique perspective." So while Cisneros herself sees the role of the writer as a translator, what my project is interested in is the role of the reader as a translator as well. When a reader approaches the text, their own language and experiences and knowledge all influence the way that they interpret it. Because Cisneros is so widely taught in American schools, she's a very varied audience with different levels of familiarity with the Spanish language and Chicano cultural references. When I was considering what approach I wanted to take with Cisneros' writing, I was interested in the relationship between the cultural background and language of the reader with how they would interpret her text. A major distinction between different readers I made was between monolingual English readers and bilingual English and Spanish readers. And there were different literary theories that influenced the way that I approach her text, the first being reader response theory. This theory focused on the relationship of the reader to the text, and theorists like Louise Rosenblatt have argued that the reader draws on past linguistic and life experiences in order to create a text meaning. Another theorist, Wolfgang Iser, wrote, "In the view of growing interpenetration of cultures, we have to remind ourselves of what interpretation has always been, an act of translation. So a reader, especially when they're considering a text that contains a perspective from a culture that's different from their own, is drawing upon their own culture to translate what the words on the page say." Another reader response theorist, Stanley Fish, wrote about the concept of the informed reader. He argues that the ideal reader is one who is a competent speaker of the language of the text, is in full possession of the knowledge of different semantic properties of the text, and has literary competence. This refers to whether or not the reader will know the cultural and literary references that are contained in the text. And the second theory I was drawing upon is post-colonial theory. And this theory looks at literature through the lens of imperialism on colonized cultures. And post-colonialism deals with her text in different ways, and because she has said that she considers Texas and southwestern United States to be colonized Mexico. It's territory that was once Mexican and now belongs to the United States. There's also the legacy of Spanish imperialism on Mexican society and cultural imperialism in the United States that pressures immigrant communities, including Chicanos, to assimilate to the country's more Anglo roots. So using these theories as a lens to analyze her writing, I looked at two texts by Sandra Cisneros. The first is her 2002 novel, Caramelo. The story is a retelling of a Mexican-American family's history from the perspective of the daughter who acts as a narrator. The narration shifts between time and place and tells a multi-generational story as she struggles to form a sense of her own identity. To analyze this book, I focus on the use of linguistic code switching in her writing. Code switching refers to shifts between languages in the same sentence or expression, and is a natural function of speech between bilingual speakers. Bilingual speakers will shift from one language to the other without interrupting their conversational flow and without really being aware that that's what they're doing. And this is a major characteristic of Cisneros' writing. She writes mostly in English, but with Spanish words and phrases mixed in throughout the text. This will influence how different readers will interpret her writing based on whether or not they understand what the Spanish says. When Cisneros uses Spanish in the text, she sometimes immediately follows with its English translation. And this can be seen as an accommodating move towards monolingual English readers who don't have to consult a dictionary or interrupt their reading to find out what the Spanish means. Sometimes she does not offer direct translation, which can be seen as alienating to these same readers. She also specifically references how sometimes when you use a direct translation from Spanish to English, it doesn't translate directly or have the same connotation, even when it's directly translated. During these moments, the narrator of the text is aware of the act of code switching itself. For example, this quote is during a moment when the narrator is describing her grandfather's face from the grandmother's perspective. She uses a Spanish word for freckles, lunares. She says, "Here I must insist on using the word lunares, literally moons, but I mean moles, or freckles, or beauty spots, though none of these words comes close to capturing the Spanish equivalent with its sensibility of charm and poetry." Here she is showing the ways in which the monolingual reader might miss out on the sentiment and connotation of certain Spanish words, even if they directly translate their meaning. It points out to the monolingual reader that they might not have full access to the text significance, even if they know exactly what it's saying, and they might not realize what they're missing without this kind of move to make them aware of what's happening. Switching between codes is also characteristic of Chicano Spanish, which is a hybrid language that mixes English and Spanish, but many see as its unique language in its own right. It's an important part of the Chicano community's identity and plays a similar role to the protagonist as it does for this community identity. The code switching in her language is a part of her family's way of speaking, an important part of who she is. Then, in the second part of my paper, I focus on the impact of cultural literacy and Mexican mythology to readers' interpretation of Cisneros' writing. A lot of her stories refers to legendary figures from Mexican cultures, and the readers who are familiar with these legends are the ones that will understand the full significance in the text. For example, her short story, Woman Hollering Creek, draws upon the legendary figure of La Llorona. La Llorona is a legend that's centuries old and one of the most famous stories in Mexican mythology. It's a ghost story about a woman who, after being abandoned by the father of her children, drowns her children in a river. In the afterlife, she is forced to haunt the banks of rivers in search of her children. Traditionally, it's often told as a scary story to children to try to keep them in line, or as a warning to women to get them to follow certain traditional societal norms. I looked at how this legend's significance could shape how different readers approach Cisneros' story. In her story, Woman Hollering Creek, the traditional meaning of this myth is at first reinforced and then becomes subverted. The story is about a Mexican woman who crosses the border to Texas in order to be married. She's very isolated in her new home because she doesn't speak any English, and her husband becomes abusive. She has no resources to escape from her husband until an economically and socially independent woman named Felice is able to give her a ride to a bus back towards Mexico. In the beginning of this story, when she is trapped in an abusive marriage, she associates a creek that's by her house that she feels very connected to with the wails of La Llorona, who is supposed to haunt rivers. She associates that figure's pain with her own, reinforcing the traditional themes of the myth about suffering. However, her interpretation of the creek shifts when she comes into contact with Felice, who's not aware of the traditional story and associates her own meaning to the creek, which is one of liberation. The last moment of the story is a scene in which the protagonist and Felice are driving across the creek away from her husband, and the sound of the creek actually mirrors the sound of her own laughter. The original associations of a legend behind the story are shifted and reimagined. While the last passage of the story is optimistic, it is also open-ended, and leaves it up to the reader to interpret what happens next, and if her escape from her husband succeeds and really leads to a better life or not. And that brings me to some conclusions that I make about the way that Cisneros constructs this narrative. I think that by closing the story in such an open-ended way that leaves it up to interpretation, Cisneros actually encourages the readers to go beyond just reading as interpretation and becoming collaborators in creating their own stories. While reading is an active process of creating meaning, in a story like this, it also becomes a collaborative project between the writer and the reader. Thank you, and I'll take any questions if you have any.
I think earlier in your presentation you mentioned how some readers might be alienated because they don't necessarily understand all of the connotations that go along with the text being used, especially if they're maybe not aware of like post-colonial legacies or things of that nature, especially if we've grown up in the United States. So what do you see that if we were getting more of these kinds of texts in school or in the education system then too, that would be a way to sort of break through and, I mean, Cisneros regards it at text as a borderlands between cultures. So do you think that she can open up that borderlands kind of culture to students, like if they're just engaging with the text from a younger age, or in the school, or do you feel like it is there a challenge of it reinforcing stereotypes, or maybe just reinforcing alienation, or do you see it as a potential where people can finally get some crossover and understanding?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that like Cisneros herself, like having voices like from Mexican American authors is definitely a way of kind of educating people who might not have been introduced to like Spanish cultural references or Mexican American history. It's a way to educate them from a perspective that really comes from that culture. And like, for example, in her book, she'll try to include like facts about history, about the Mexican Revolution or things like that. And she specifically said that that's kind of a project she undertakes in order to educate people from a kind of history that might be hidden from the dominant culture. So I think that's definitely part of like what she does through writing.